Damien Blackwell stood at the edge of the ballroom, a silent storm in a sea of excess. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria, the elite of Manhattan floated through conversations dressed in couture and intention. Laughter sparkled alongside champagne bubbles, and the orchestra's music rose above the din, elegant and unbothered. But Damien remained still, untouched by the grandeur surrounding him. He wasn't here to celebrate or to be seen. He was here to assess, to calculate, like he always did. With his tailored black suit and an expression carved from ice, Damien was the kind of man people watched from a distance but never approached without reason. Billionaire, heir to Blackwell Holdings, and known for turning dying companies into gold, he was the embodiment of control. But beneath the surface, no one saw the ruin he kept buried. A ruin shaped by betrayal. 3 years ago, he had walked in on the woman he once loved, Vivian Aldridge, in the arms of his fiercest rival. The betrayal had been exquisite in its cruelty, not only personal but strategic. Vivian had used his love, his trust and his name to gain access to insider deals, to climb faster in the corporate world. When she walked away, she left Damien with nothing but a heart split open and a lesson that hardened every edge of him. Love is a weapon, and trusting the wrong person could destroy you. Since then, Damien had made a quiet art of staying detached. Everything he did, from acquisitions to dinner reservations, was precise, efficient, and emotionless. His name alone moved markets. His presence froze rooms. And yet tonight, something simmered beneath that calm exterior. "Still pretending you enjoy these things?" came a voice behind him, dry and amused. Jasper Quinn, his longtime friend and partner in an investment firm, approached with 2 glasses of bourbon. Dressed like a man who thrived on chaos, Jasper offered Damien one of the glasses and a knowing look. "I'm not pretending," Damien replied coolly, accepting the drink without turning. "I'm observing." "You always say that," Jasper smirked, clinking their glasses. "But you're not as unreadable as you think." Damien finally turned, arching a brow. "You're projecting again." "No," Jasper said, leaning in. "I'm recognizing a pattern. You look for order in disorder. So let me give you a puzzle." Damien said nothing, waiting. Jasper tilted his head toward the far side of the ballroom. Sienna Hayes, over by the bar, in the crimson dress. Damien followed his gaze. There she was. Even in a room full of people trying to be noticed, Sienna Hayes stood out like a spark in a storm. Her auburn hair tumbled freely over bare shoulders, her dress clinging to her like scandal itself. She laughed too loud, drank too fast, and walked like she didn't care who she offended. There was something theatrical about her, the kind of recklessness that wasn't born of confidence, but of pain hidden well. "That's Julian Hayes' daughter," Jasper explained. "You know, the tech magnate who sold his soul for political capital. She's been disowned more times than I can count. Tabloids love her. Drug rumors, car chases, brawls at fundraisers. Her stepmother's trying to marry her off to a state. Senator twice her age." Damien watched her carefully. "She doesn't belong here." "Exactly," Jasper said. "She's chaos, untamable, a walking headline." Damien took another sip of his drink. "You have a point?" Jasper grinned. "I bet you can't turn her into a poised society wife in 3 months." Damien turned to him fully now, amused, despite himself. "What is this? Some high school dare?" "No. A challenge," Jasper said. "Marry her. Refine her. Shape her into the perfect wife for the boardroom and the ballroom." Damien chuckled once, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Why would I do that? Because you hate unpredictability. And she is pure unpredictability. And because I know you, Damien, you want to prove that there's nothing you can't control, not even a woman like her." There was silence between them for a moment. Then Jasper added casually, $3 million. My side. If you succeed." Damien set his glass down. "And if I lose?" "You give me controlling interest in Coltrane Pharmaceuticals." It was a bold stake. Damien's gaze returned to Sienna, who was now spinning in slow, lazy circles near the orchestra, clearly buzzed. A security guard hovered nearby, unsure if she was about to start dancing or start a riot. She was a mess, but she was also magnetic. And in that moment, Damien saw her not as a woman, but as a test. A way to bury the last remnants of his failed past and prove to himself that he could still master the uncontrollable. "Deal," he said quietly. Jasper raised his glass. "God help you." 2 days later, Damien sent for her. Sienna didn't come quietly. She arrived at Blackwell Tower like a thunderstorm, late, hungover and wearing sunglasses indoors. But beneath the defiance there was something else. Curiosity. She sat across from Damien in his penthouse office, feet kicked up on the expensive glass table, sipping espresso like she was mocking him. "You know you're not my type," she said. Damien didn't flinch. "I'm not here to be anyone's type." "Then what do you want, me Ice King?" He slid a document toward her, a thick contract, crisp and cold as steel. "A marriage. 3 months. You play the role. You attend events. I provide financial independence. And you walk away with $5 million. She blinked. "That's it? No sex? No strings?" "No emotions," he said simply. Sienna leaned back, calculating. She knew the senator her stepmother wanted to force on her wouldn't take no for an answer much longer. She was running out of time and out of options. But here was this man, arrogant, cold, powerful, offering her freedom. If she could just endure 3 months. "What's in it for you?" she asked, suspicious. "Let's just say you're a means to an end," she studied him. "You're serious. Deadly." A long silence followed. Then Sienna smirked, reached for the pen, and signed her name with a flourish. "Well then, Mr. Blackwell," she said, "let the performance begin." As Damien watched her leave, something in his chest shifted. Too slight to name. But something had just begun, and it wasn't the marriage. It was the unraveling of her, of him, of everything they thought they understood about control, desire, and the price of pretending. He had no idea what he'd invited into his life, but neither did she. And somewhere beneath the contracts, behind all the ice and fire, their real story was already waiting to burn. The Chateau Frontenac stood bathed in the soft golden glow of early evening, its towers piercing the lavender sky like a fairy tale painting. The historic venue had hosted royalty and diplomats, billionaires and magnates, but tonight it bore witness to something colder than any of them. A wedding without love. Inside the grand ballroom, opulence reigned. Crystal chandeliers bathed the walls in light. White lilies and orchids adorned every corner, and the air was heavy with the scent of polished silver, expensive perfume, and old money. Guests whispered behind raised glasses, speculation cloaked in civility. They had heard the rumors, of course, how Damien Blackwell, the steely titan of Manhattan finance, had suddenly announced his engagement to a woman known more for scandal than grace. No one believed it was love. At the altar, Damien stood unmoving, as if sculpted from stone. In his tailored black tuxedo, he looked every bit the part. Handsome, composed, unreadable. Only those who truly knew him, if any such people existed, could see the tension behind his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at the flower arrangements, or the flickering candles, or the symphony quartet. He looked only forward. Sienna arrived moments later, gliding down the aisle with practiced elegance and an expression that betrayed nothing. Her gown was a masterpiece of couture, off-the-shoulder silk that flowed behind her like water, hugging her form with unapologetic precision. But her eyes, lined with just a touch too much kohl, were distant, as if walking towards something she had already mentally left behind. She didn't smile. She didn't falter. Her gaze met Damien's with cool detachment, and in that quiet exchange was the acknowledgement of everything this wasn't. It wasn't love. It wasn't hope. It wasn't even revenge. It was survival. The officiant began. The ceremony, his voice polished and indifferent, echoing off marble walls with almost theatrical detachment. Damien responded when prompted, his "I do" crisp and emotionless. Sienna echoed it without pause, without tremble. No one in the audience felt moved. There was no mistaking the nature of this union. There was no kiss, no warmth, no pretense of romance. Instead, Damien slid a flawless emerald-cut diamond onto Sienna's finger with the same focus he used to close multi-million-dollar mergers. It was a transaction, pure and unadorned. When the ceremony ended and the applause, polite mechanical, died down, they walked out together like two strangers bound by invisible threads, their fingers linked only because decorum demanded it. The photographers took their pictures flash after flash, but neither of them really looked at the cameras. They had both mastered the art of appearances long ago. The reception, held in the ballroom's adjoining atrium, was lavish and joyless. Silver-gilded menus and champagne pyramids sparkled under the lights. An orchestra played sweeping classics, and waiters moved with choreographed precision between silk-covered tables. But amidst all this grandeur, Sienna stood alone. She had greeted guests, played her part, smiled at old men who whispered judgments behind veiled compliments. But after the first hour, Damien had disappeared, drawn into deep discussions with shareholders, politicians, and the kind of men who used cigars as weapons. He didn't once look back to find her. Sienna leaned against the terrace railing, a flute of champagne dangling from her fingers. The lights of Quebec City glittered below, tranquil and detached. She took a sip, let the cold burn her throat, and wondered how many people in this room truly thought she wanted this. They thought she married him for his money. They thought she was here because she was reckless enough to play wife for a man like Damien Blackwell. They didn't know that her stepmother had threatened to have her committed if she didn't agree to the arranged marriage with the senator. They didn't know that her father, the same man who once told her she'd ruined the family name, had signed the engagement contract without asking her. They didn't know this marriage was her escape route. They didn't know that this was her version of fighting back. Inside, the night wore on. The band played a jazz set. Guests danced in practiced rhythm. Champagne continued to flow, but Sienna remained alone, her body present, her heart elsewhere. And then came the night, the moment that loomed over every hour of the day. The honeymoon. Suite was warm, dimly lit with soft gold lighting and scented candles. It had been meticulously prepared, every detail designed to evoke romance. But to Sienna it felt like a hotel room dressed in costume, artificial and hollow. She stood by the window, the white fabric of her gown falling like moonlight around her as she looked out into the cold. The city lights shimmered on the river, below. Her bare shoulders glowed faintly under the chandelier, too beautiful to be real. Behind her, Damien stepped into the room and loosened his tie. He didn't speak. She didn't move. Eventually, he broke the silence. "We don't have to." "Pretend," he said, voice low, almost weary. Sienna turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not pretending," she said. "But you are." Damien studied her, his eyes unreadable. He had expected indifference, maybe even seduction. What he didn't expect was the quiet fierceness in her gaze. She walked over, stopped just short of him. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I've never done this before. I've never belonged to anyone. Despite what they say about me. Despite the stories." Damien's brow twitched, but he said nothing. Sienna stepped back, gathering her robe around her as if reclaiming her armor. "I know you think I'm some spoiled, overexposed mess," she said. "That this marriage is just a step in a game you're playing. And maybe it is, but don't assume you know me." His silence stretched between them like wire. When he finally spoke, it was softer than she expected. "Why did you agree to this then?" She looked him dead in the eyes. "Because I had no other way out. Because my life isn't a fairy tale. Because I'd rather sign my name to a cold deal than be sold off to a man twice my age who looks at me like I'm his next yacht." Something in Damien shifted. He wasn't sure what it was. Sienna turned back toward the window. "I'm not yours, Damien. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I signed your contract. I'll wear your ring. I'll play the part. Just don't make the mistake of thinking I'm easy." She didn't wait for his reply. She simply walked into the adjoining room and closed the door behind her. And Damien, standing alone in the flickering half-light, realized that what he had thought would be a simple arrangement was already spiraling into something far more dangerous. Not because he couldn't control it, but because he was starting to feel something he had spent years silencing. And Sienna Hayes, wild, wounded, and stunning in her defiance, was no longer just a name on a document. She was a mirror, and he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The Blackwell estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, looked like a dream carved from frost. Nestled along the icy banks of the Long Island Sound, it rose with unapologetic grandeur, its classical architecture immaculate, its stonework framed by snow-covered pines and hedges clipped with military precision. It was breathtaking, but it didn't breathe. The house was a still life, beautiful, cold, and designed to be admired rather than lived in. For Sienna, it felt like being buried alive in luxury, from the moment she stepped through its grand iron doors. She understood exactly what kind of life Damien Blackwell had built for himself. Perfect, efficient, and sterile. Every hallway gleamed like a showroom. Every curtain hung in a calculated arc. The staff, though polite, moved like ghosts, in uniform, vanishing behind soundproof doors at the end of every request. Everything here had a place. She didn't. In the early days of their arrangement, Sienna wandered the halls like a misplaced spirit. She slept in a wing separate from Damien, dined in silence at a table long enough to host foreign diplomats, and watched from the windows. As the snow fell day after day without pause or reason. No one spoke unless they had to. The house operated like a clock, wound tightly by the man she now called her husband. And so she did what she always did when she felt cornered. She rebelled. It started small. She redecorated one of the sitting rooms into an art studio, splashing color across the walls like an act of defiance. She ordered vintage motorcycles and parked them on the pristine gravel driveway. One night, she set up a jazz quartet in the conservatory and invited the house staff to join her for drinks, declaring it a mandatory break from the monotony. Wordlessly, Damien observed her from the shadows of his study. He didn't stop her. He didn't speak. But he noticed. He always noticed. She drove recklessly through town, garnering local headlines. She returned home late, smelling of whiskey and roses. She wore leather in a household made of silk. She tested every line of his neatly drawn world as if daring it to crack. But even as she played the part of the wild, untamable bride, there were moments, quiet ones, when Sienna sat in the garden, wrapped in a coat too thin for winter, sketching a pair of mourning doves she saw each morning at the edge of the hedge. Moments when she spoke softly to the elderly butler, asking about his arthritis and whether he missed his late wife. Moments when she paused in the marble hallway outside Damien's office, fingers lingering against the doorframe, listening for some sign that he was more than the myth she'd married. The house watched her. And Damien did too. From behind his glass-walled study, he saw her more clearly than he wanted to admit. He saw the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she was trying not to cry. The way she handed out $100 bills to the staff without ever mentioning it. The way she lingered too long beside his parents' portrait in the West Corridor. The woman the tabloids called reckless was in fact deliberate, hurting, deep. One night, curiosity pushed him too far. He followed her. It was nearly midnight when Sienna slipped out in her black Aston Martin. No driver, no escort. Damien tailed her from a distance, headlights off, unsure of what he expected to find, but what he saw stunned him. She wasn't going to a party. She wasn't meeting a lover. She pulled into the quiet lot of a rundown community center in the Bronx. There, beneath dim streetlights, she popped the trunk and pulled out crates of food, boxes of blankets, stacks of hygiene kits. No cameras, no entourage. One by one, she handed them out to the small crowd gathered near the building's steps. Families, addicts, veterans. She crouched low to speak with them, not as a benefactor but as one of them. Her voice was gentle. Her laugh, when it came, was genuine. Damien watched her from the car, unmoving. She stayed for an hour, then left quietly, and he didn't know what to do with what he had just seen. The next morning, he was already in the breakfast room when she walked in. Her hair was damp, skin fresh from a shower, wearing an oversized sweatshirt that clashed with the room's antique grandeur. She raised an eyebrow at him. Didn't peg you for a morning person. He folded the newspaper calmly. I adapt. Right, she said, pouring herself a coffee. Just like your decor. Timeless, severe, and utterly inflexible. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he asked, You were out late. Her cup paused midair. I didn't realize I had a curfew. You don't. Then why mention it? Damien's eyes met hers. Because I want to understand. The words hung in the air like smoke. She stared at him almost suspiciously. Understand what exactly? You, he said simply. She laughed once, hollow and disbelieving. Good luck with that. He said nothing more. And she walked away, but not as fast as she usually did. Later that evening, they found themselves in the library. She was curled in the leather chair with a novel splayed across her lap. Damien entered without a word and sat across from her with a folder of reports. For an hour neither spoke. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt shared. That was the beginning of something neither of them recognized. The shift. Sienna started joining him in the conservatory in the mornings, sometimes sketching, sometimes saying nothing at all. Damien began leaving his study door open more often. He passed her books. She made sarcastic comments about his wine collection. They started playing chess. She cheated. He let her. He didn't know why. And she began noticing things. The scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. The way his voice dropped when he spoke of his father's early death. The way he rubbed his temple when a memory crept in uninvited. One night. A snowstorm swept across Greenwich, trapping them inside. The lights flickered once. Sienna stood at the window watching the flakes fall like ash. "I hate how quiet it gets in this house," she whispered. Damien stood beside her, arms crossed. "I used to think silence meant peace." She looked up at him. "Does it?" "No," he said after a pause. "Now it just means something's missing." She didn't reply, but she didn't move away. The following morning, she was gone before sunrise. But she left her sketchbook open on the table, and on the page was a drawing of the two of them, Damien standing by the window and Sienna watching him from across the room, neither looking at the other, both unmistakably reaching. He traced his fingers over the page, and for the first time in years, the emptiness inside him stirred, because Sienna Hayes was no longer just the woman in the wager. She was becoming the one thing Damien Blackwell had spent his entire life trying to avoid. Someone who could see through him, and maybe, just maybe, someone he wanted to be seen by. The days slipped by with quiet changes, too subtle to announce themselves, too intimate to ignore. Blackwell Manor remained vast, composed and aloof, but something in its silence had softened. The rooms felt warmer. The kitchen no longer echoed with only the clink of silverware. Sienna's laughter, rare but honest, had begun to curl around the corners of the halls like incense. The quiet war between her and Damien had cooled into something else, something stranger, an uneasy peace thick with tension neither of them could quite name. They weren't lovers. They weren't enemies. They existed in the space between, circling each other like two forces trying to understand gravity for the first time. Sienna had stopped pushing so hard. The rebellion became more measured, no longer defiant for the sake of defiance but purposeful. She spent her afternoons in the art studio, experimenting with abstract colors. She took long walks through the estate's winter gardens, whispering stories to the frozen roses. And in the evenings, she and Damien found themselves drawn together more often than not. Chess games where strategy became foreplay. Dinners where silence slowly gave way to confession. It wasn't love, but it was movement. And in a house where nothing ever shifted, even that felt profound. It was Damien who broke the rhythm first. One evening, after she'd left the library with a worn copy of Wuthering Heights tucked under her arm, he followed her quietly and found her curled on the chaise near the fireplace. Her hair was loose, spilling over the cashmere throw like molten copper. She didn't look up when he entered. "Why that book?" he asked softly, more out of curiosity than conversation. Sienna shrugged. "It's the only story I know where love doesn't save anyone." Damien lingered by the door. "You think love is supposed to save us?" She closed the book. "No, but when it breaks us, it should at least be honest about it." There it was, another glimpse into the hollowed center of her. He wanted to ask what had broken her, who had carved away the girl who once believed in something warmer. But instead, he sat beside her without another word, letting the firelight stretch between them. They stayed that way for a long time, separate, close. Then, as winter softened into a tentative spring, the illusion shattered. It arrived in the form of an envelope. No return address, just her name in smooth, deliberate ink. She found it resting on her vanity like a ghost. Curious, Sienna opened it, expecting perhaps another passive-aggressive invitation from some society function she had no interest in attending. What she found were photographs. Sharp, colorful, cruel. Damien, seated across from Vivian in an upscale Manhattan restaurant. Her hand rested lightly on his. His posture leaned forward, intimate, almost tender. Another image showed Vivian laughing, her head tilted toward him, his gaze steady on hers. They looked like a couple caught in a moment they shouldn't have shared. Sienna stared at the photos, her hands trembling even as her jaw tightened in defiance. Her heart, traitorous and too exposed, thudded like a warning beneath her ribs. It made sense now, the past week of distracted glances, his missed dinners, the unreturned messages. The Damien she'd slowly begun to trust had reverted to his default state, detached, unreachable. And now she saw why. He had gone back to the woman who had once destroyed him. She didn't cry. She laughed instead, a quiet, bitter sound that didn't reach her eyes. It was the laugh of a girl who had let herself hope and now felt foolish for it. Sienna carried the envelope to the drawing room and placed it silently on the table beside the brandy decanter. Then she left the house without a word. For 2 days, she disappeared. Damien didn't know until the housekeeper informed him she'd packed an overnight bag and taken the black sedan, alone. No destination, no message. He found the envelope that night, still sealed with a blood-red sticker she hadn't bothered to remove. When he opened it and saw the photos, his entire body went still. Vivienne. He remembered the dinner clearly. She had shown up unannounced at an investors' event and manipulated her way into his schedule. He had tolerated her presence because the meeting mattered, but never once had he touched her. The images had been expertly staged, timed at angles. That told a different story. And someone had ensured those images reached Sienna. The weight of it landed squarely on his chest. Not just the betrayal of Vivienne's games, but his failure to see how vulnerable Sienna had become to something real between them. She had begun to trust him. He had allowed her to trust him. And now he had allowed that trust to be destroyed. When Sienna returned, it was without drama. She walked into the manor just after dusk, her coat wrapped tightly around her frame, face pale but composed. She didn't speak as she passed Damien in the foyer. He followed her to the stairwell, uncertain. "Sienna," he began. She turned slowly. "Don't. I need to explain." Her voice was calm, but there was a tremble in it he hadn't heard before. "The time to explain would have been before I had to see you touching her. I didn't." She held up a hand. "I don't care if you did. I care that I was starting to believe you were different, and that you let me believe that while entertaining the ghost of someone who once destroyed you." Damien looked at her. His mouth parted slightly, but the words refused to form. She stepped past him, her eyes shining but dry. "Next time, if you're going to lie, do it completely. Half-truths are just cruelty in disguise." She didn't cry that night, but he did. Alone in his study, Damien sat at the desk and opened the small sketchbook she'd left behind during her absence. It was filled with unfinished drawings, portraits of rooms in the house, details from their dinners, a few studies of his face done in soft pencil. Each page was a record of observation, of intimacy. She had been watching him too, trying to understand, and he had let her down. It wasn't about the photos, it wasn't even about Vivienne. It was about the wound inside Sienna that he had seen glimpses of but never asked about. A wound that whispered, "People leave. People lie. Don't give them the power to prove it again." He had proved it anyway. But something else stirred beneath the regret. Resolve. If he had wounded her, he would find a way to repair what he'd broken. And if someone was trying to sabotage what they were slowly, imperfectly building, he would find them too. Because for the first time in years, Damien Blackwell wasn't protecting a company. He was trying to protect a woman, and maybe, if he was brave enough, the fragile blooming thing between them as well. The office lights of Blackwell Tower burned late into the night, casting cold reflections against Damien's eyes as he stood alone, staring out over the city that once bowed to his every ambition. New York was beautiful from above, glittering and indifferent. It had always felt like his ally, sharp, commanding, relentless. But now it felt like a stranger. He turned back to the boardroom, where the last of his senior advisors had left behind spreadsheets, emergency memos, and projections that painted a picture as bleak as it was honest. Blackwell Holdings was bleeding. The orchestrated attack on his company was not just a financial threat. It was a dismantling of trust, a quiet coup driven by sabotage. Vivienne's fingerprints were everywhere. She had approached stakeholders in the shadows, spun false narratives, disrupted supply chains, and manipulated regulatory partners. One by one, deals collapsed. Support eroded. His empire, flawlessly built over a decade, was beginning to buckle under the weight of her vengeance. Damien hadn't told Sienna. He had meant to shield her from the chaos. Perhaps he'd even hoped to spare her from the wreckage if it all fell apart. But now he saw the flaw in that instinct. In trying to protect her, he had only isolated himself further, and worse, allowed the silence to breed doubt between them. She had been gone for days since the envelope. Her absence echoed louder than her presence ever had. And though she had returned to the manor, she remained distant, her footsteps quieter, her eyes unreadable. Damien felt her slipping through his fingers. He didn't know that while he was fighting for the company in boardrooms, she was fighting for him elsewhere, in secret, in silence, and at great cost. That truth revealed itself the next morning when his assistant Marcus entered with a file in hand. "We traced the emergency investment," Marcus said quietly. "It came through a private trust, but the trail, once you look closely, leads to the Carter estate." Damien looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Carter?" Marcus nodded. "E. Carter, Sienna's mother's trust fund. She made the investment through a silent intermediary. She didn't want you to know. Time stilled. The air inside the room thickened. Damien took the file and flipped through the pages. Every detail was precise. The offshore transfers, the legal proxies, the anonymized accounts, all designed to hide the source. But the signature buried on page 5 was unmistakable. Sienna Hayes Blackwell had saved him. The woman he thought he had wronged, the woman who had every reason to walk away from his life, had chosen instead to become the very thing he had never asked for and never believed he deserved, his ally. She hadn't confronted him, hadn't waited for a thank you. She had simply acted, without pride, without condition, without fanfare. The weight of it crushed him. He had allowed her to doubt him, to suffer in silence, while she quietly gave away her inheritance to rescue the company he had once believed more important than anything. And now that company was breathing again. Because of her. He sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the folder. All his meticulous control, all his logic and power had failed him. It had taken her wildness, her recklessness, her quiet generosity to save what he had built. And he hadn't even noticed. When he returned to the manor, she was in the greenhouse, carefully trimming a line of winter roses, her expression calm, composed. He stood at the door for a long time before he found the strength to speak. "I know what you did," he said. She didn't look at him. "I'm sure you do." "I should have." "Don't," she cut in gently, finally turning. "You don't owe me anything." "You gave up everything," he said, his voice raw. "Your security, your silence, and I never even saw it." Sienna looked at him, something soft flickering behind her defenses. "I didn't do it for your gratitude, Damien. I did it because you were drowning, and I couldn't watch it happen." He took a step toward her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She offered a small, tired smile. "Because you would have stopped me." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're right." And then he said the thing that had been building in his chest since the day she signed that contract. "I don't want to play the role anymore." Sienna stilled. "What role?" "Husband out of convenience. Man behind a mask. I want to be whatever this could be, if you let me." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, the sound of her phone buzzing shattered the moment. She glanced down, her brow furrowing. It was her driver. There'd been a delay, an issue with the car. She excused herself, promising to return shortly. Damien watched her leave, heart aching with words left unsaid. She never came back. An hour later, Damien's phone rang. There had been an accident. On the icy curve just before the manor's north gate, a black SUV had collided with her car. The driver was unharmed. Sienna, unconscious, had been rushed to the hospital with head trauma and multiple lacerations. Time fractured. Damien drove faster than he ever had in his life. By the time he arrived, she was already in surgery. The doctors spoke in medical code. Stabilized. Blood loss, potential swelling. But he barely heard them. He sat beside her hospital bed for hours afterward, holding her hand, watching the monitors, feeling the weight of her fragility in every shallow breath she took. When he looked at her pale face, bruised and still, everything else fell away. His company, the wager, the betrayals, all that remained was her, and a fear he hadn't felt since. He was a boy, the fear of losing someone he couldn't replace. He didn't cry, not until Marcus returned later that night with another file. Security footage. A black SUV had been following her car long before the crash. The license plate belonged to a rental, under Vivian's name. There was no doubt now. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a message. Damien stared at the screen, rage flooding his chest like poison. All the control he had cultivated for years broke under the force of it. She had gone too far. Vivian had tried to destroy his company. Now she had tried to destroy the woman he loved. He made a single phone call, to his attorneys, to the police, to anyone who could make the wheels turn fast. He would see to it personally. Vivian would pay. But first he returned to the hospital where Sienna still lay unconscious. He took her hand again, softer this time, bringing it to his lips. "I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner," he whispered. "I see you now, and I swear to you I won't lose you." Her hand didn't move. But for the first time that night, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost her yet. The first sign of life came in the smallest movement. her fingers twitching beneath his hand. It was almost imperceptible, but Damien felt it instantly. For hours he had sat in silence at Sienna's bedside, his palm wrapped around hers, listening to the machines that kept rhythm with her stillness. The doctors had said she would wake up, eventually, but the word had stretched thin in his chest, weighed down by guilt, dread, and the unrelenting fear that he might have waited too long to say the things he should have said from the beginning. When her eyelids fluttered open, slowly, dazed, the breath Damien had been holding for days finally released. Her gaze was hazy, searching. But when her eyes found his, there was recognition, fragile, tentative, but there. "You're here," she whispered, her voice brittle with fatigue. "I'm here," Damien replied, his voice cracking under the weight of everything he hadn't said. "And I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled in his eyes, unashamed and quiet. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair away from her temple, careful not to disturb the bruises that marred her otherwise. Flawless skin. She looked different, lying there. More delicate, yes, but stronger too, like someone who had walked through fire and returned with ashes in her eyes. "You know now, don't you?" she murmured, her breath shallow. He nodded. "I know you saved everything. I know you gave without asking for anything in return. I know you've been beside me in ways I was too blind to see." Sienna tried to smile, but her face winced from the effort. "I just didn't want to watch you fall. Not like that." Damien's chest tightened. "And I let you think I didn't care. I let you feel alone in all of it." Her silence wasn't agreement, but it wasn't protest either. And in that silence, he heard everything. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he continued softly. "But not loving you. That would have been the worst of them all." Sienna's eyes flickered. "You love me?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "I do. Not because I'm supposed to. Not because of a deal or a game or a second chance. But because you saw me when I didn't want to be seen. Because you stood beside me when you had every reason to walk away. And because when everything was falling apart, it was your strength, not mine, that held us up." She let her eyes fall closed, tears slipping down her temples. "I thought I had to be strong alone." "You don't," Damien said. "Not anymore. Not ever again." The days that followed moved slowly, tenderly. Sienna's recovery was steady, her silence gradually replaced with quiet conversation. Damien remained by her side through every scan, every therapy session, every moment when she felt less like herself. He brought her sketchbook to the hospital, read aloud when her eyes tired, and held her hand every night until she fell asleep. Moinda Ika. She was strong enough to return home. Blackwell Manor felt different. It wasn't the house that had changed, but the people in it. There were now fresh tulips in the entrance hall, music in the drawing room, and laughter that echoed down corridors once cloaked in stillness. Sienna painted again, though slower, more deliberately. Damien worked less, stayed closer, learned the art of sitting still beside someone simply to make them feel seen. They didn't speak of love every day. They didn't need to. It was in the small things, the way he now kissed her forehead before leaving a room. The way she started wearing his sweaters, claiming she hated them but never taking them off. The way they moved through space together like a pair of dancers who finally knew how not to step on each other's feet. It was in the way Damien spoke, when he arranged for Vivian's arrest. Calm, measured, but cold as ice. He had stood in the hotel suite where she lounged in silk and spite and looked her dead in the eyes as the officers read her rights. "You always underestimated me," he said. "But the worst mistake you made was underestimating her." Vivian had tried to speak, to twist her version of the story. But the truth had already buried her. There was no deal left to make, no more secrets to hide. And when she was escorted from the room, Damien didn't feel triumphant. He felt finished, free, and he returned to the manor that night not as a man consumed by revenge, but as a man choosing peace. Sienna met him at the garden's edge, where the last traces of snow had melted and new growth curled tentatively toward the light. She wore no makeup, her hair tied in a loose knot, her eyes tired but bright. They didn't speak for a long moment. Then Damien reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, red velvet, weathered at the corners as if it had waited longer than it should have. "I proposed to you once for all the wrong reasons," he said quietly. "Out of ego, out of pride, out of control. And you said yes because you had nowhere else to go." Sienna's lips parted, but he shook his head gently and knelt before her. "This time," he continued, I'm asking for the only reason that matters." He opened the box. Inside was a ring unlike the first. No towering diamond, no flash of wealth. Just a gold band with a single sapphire, deep and dark and endless. "I love you," he said. "Not because I can fix you, not because you're perfect, but because you're the only person who ever made me want to be more than I am. You've seen every corner of me, and you're still here, and I want to spend the rest of my life earning that." Sienna didn't cry immediately. She knelt too until they were eye to eye and placed her hand on his chest. "You already have," she whispered. And when she kissed him, it was not a kiss of passion but of recognition. Two people who had seen each other at their most broken and still chosen to stay. Months passed. Sienna launched a foundation using the name Carter in honor of the mother she once thought she'd never live up to. The mission was simple: give young women the resources to reclaim their lives. Her story became the spark for others, those who knew rebellion wasn't failure, that being difficult often meant surviving what tried to erase you. Damien stood beside her at every event, proud but quiet, the anchor who no longer needed control to feel strong. Their love wasn't perfect. They still argued. She still pushed. He still retreated sometimes. But they always returned. To the truth. To each other. And one spring evening, beneath a canopy of wisteria in the garden they had rebuilt together, they renewed their vows alone. No cameras, no guests. Just the rustle of petals and the vows whispered from one scarred heart to another. Not for forever, but for every moment that followed. Because real love, they had learned, was not the absence of pain. It was the courage to heal together, and the choice, again and again, to stay. What did you think of Damien and Sienna's journey? Do you believe love can truly grow from broken places? Drop your thoughts in the comments so others can read and reflect too. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support this channel. Your support is what keeps new powerful stories coming.